look, I'm part of something called the Campaign for a Socialist Party, which is not an ideological sect, but rather simply an activist movement to try to help rebuild civil society institutions for working class people, to really just start over from the ground up, to stop being aligned with either of the capitalist parties, to try to found a politics in society rather than within the state. So that said, I would be very open to talking to people who like J.D. Vance and who voted for J.D. Vance. And sure, I would not shy away from having any political figure on my podcast or writing about them or having them write for the magazine that we're running. But I'm not looking to, the campaign isn't looking to form a electoral political coalition.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Jacob Schell is an associate professor in geography, environment, and urban studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is the author of Giants of the Monsoon Forest, Living and Working with Elephants, and the author of Transportation and Revolt, Pigeons, Mules, Canals, and the Vanishing Geographies of Subversive Mobility. I've been following him on Twitter for a while now and have come to consider him a comrade in arms against the Democratic Party's recent project to extend and deepen the power of what's been known as the surveillance state in the past, but what I think I want to call the censorious state today. So, Jacob, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk.
Yeah. To begin with, just to clarify, I mean, am I reading you correctly that you are a leftist? You are on the left. Is that correct? Would you say that's true?
I spend so much time criticizing where the left has gone over the last couple decades that I don't see how I could coherently call myself a leftist at this point.
Oh.
I mean, there are some who maybe you consider yourself in this category. I think we've had some Twitter exchanges that suggest that maybe this is where you're coming from, and where I know figures like Freddie DeBoer are coming from, where it's like this thing called the left is this sort of item that can still be kind of like grabbed back onto and salvaged in some way. But I think at this point, I've criticized it so much and sort of come to a kind of structural theory of what's happened that puts me in a position where I don't think I can call myself a leftist. So no.
Okay, fair enough.
Saying no. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, then goodbye. No, I'm just kidding. No, well, I do believe that you can hold on to the concept of the left, or certainly the concept of socialism, without embracing what calls itself the left in American politics today, which I take to be mostly just a faction of the Democratic Party at this point. It's not actually an independent political force or political.
Yeah, and then of course, I bet you have listeners who, like, if they hear me say, "Oh yeah, I'm not a leftist," and then they hear you say something like socialism can still be saved, they might think, "Oh, this person that Doug has had on thinks that we just need to have like the Koch brothers and like a bunch of big kind of capitalist tycoons calling the shots, and trickle down economics is the way," which is also absolutely not what I think and not where I'm coming from. And I think somewhat more tentatively, there's a lot of tenets of socialism, but there's so many ways in which that could be defined that I'm very sympathetic with. I'm not sure that this thing we call leftism is actually cohering with that at this point. And I don't actually see a formula to bring those two into alignment. So anyway, I understand your explanation. So
But nonetheless, your book, Transportation Revolt, is, I think, from reading the review, a critique of the state power, and an exploration of the way radical movements and threats to the establishments, let's say, have shaped our built environment, and specifically modes of transportation. Is that true?
Yeah, that basically covers it. So that was a book. It came out in 2015, so like a while ago at this point. I mean, when the whole thing was written, this thing we call like the awakening hadn't really happened yet, because that sort of was like 2014 onward, and I really wrote that book more like between 2010 and 2013, and then it took a couple years to actually come out because of the way that academic publishing is. So it comes from a sort of different moment, though. I would still like stand by every word that I wrote in it and all the research I did. And what you said is basically right. It's an argument, and it is actually particular to technologies and infrastructures of transportation, because my big ongoing fascination as a professor or as an academic has been in transportation systems. Sometimes like, metallic, railroad kind of thing. But actually over the last decade, animal-based transportation, like elephants, camels, horses, this has really caught my attention as a research topic. But my big argument in that book anyway, is that a lot of examples in recent history, like last couple hundred years, of modes of transportation being seemingly rendered obsolete from like a technical or economic point of view was actually caused by states determining that those particular modes of transportation were unacceptably useful for rebellious movements. So my big example that consumes like actually more than like half the book, I think, is the case of British investments in canal systems in Britain, Ireland, and Canada. Because what happened during the late 19th century is Irish anti-imperial movements made particular use of the canal systems in all three of those geographic areas, actually, in order to do things like traffic their like subversive pamphlets and literature, sometimes to move guns and things like that. And they were using the canal systems and not the railroad systems, because the railroad systems, for reasons that now are sort of quaint, but were very pressing at the time, the railroad systems were easier to surveil as compared with the canal systems. And so my argument, and it's actually, maybe it's not a totally watertight argument. I've gotten some critiques from economic historians that have given me some other things to think about since then. But at any rate, the argument in that book, especially in regards to the canal example, is that the reason that like British state capital stopped investing in canal systems was because of this kind of specter of Irish revolt and other forms of revolt. So yeah, like you're saying, a very kind of is that a leftist argument? I'm not sure. Is it like, are we talking about the left of like the big NGOs? I don't think so. Actually,
I'm thinking of the left of like the Situationist International, or
it was really kind of that. I think we're on the same page. It was kind of that image of the left that I think was kind of motivating the spirit of the book, even though over the course of the book, because I actually go through lots of other examples besides the big British canal example, and sometimes the thing that actually got me interested in elephants as a topic is that one of my examples in the book is about a rebel army in northern Burma over the last 40 years or so called the Kachin Independence Army, that has used elephants as a means of kind of secretive, clandestine, subversive transportation in their efforts to like establish some sort of like political separatism from the Burmese state. Is the Kachin Independence Army leftist? You'd actually be hard pressed to like look at their like political program in terms of what they want and define any particular thing there as like left wing. So this is why it was sort of like, well, this is almost a kind of like James C. Scott, the big important political theorist who died, I think like a month or two ago. it's sort of, if it's leftist, it's kind of more that kind of suspicious of state power type of leftism. If that, I was really just interested in the transportation systems, to tell you the truth, Doug.
Okay,
Like, it was
okay.
like, what about the canals? Why don't we have more canals in these particular regions? Why aren't we using horses and mules to access certain geographies that automobiles remain kind of bad for getting to those areas? And then sort of became a decade-long obsession for me. Why aren't we using elephants for transportation in these particular monsoon landscapes that elephants are actually really mobile across? And that to me was like the big question that was motivating a lot of that type of academic research. It is true, like you're saying, a lot of the kind of initial impulse came out of a particular set of maybe like left-wing attitudes, maybe like in the double O's when I was in college and early grad school. And I think, the Situationist International, the idea that like modes of transportation that are useful for protest, I think that is how I initially kind of arrived at the idea. But then I feel like a kind of reversal almost happened, where suddenly I found that much of the left-wing coalition, by the time you get to the year 2020, if anything, is trying to, they're trying to like clamp down on free speech or prevent the mobilization of what they would consider to be subversive ideas over social media. So at that point, I was sort of glad that if you actually look through the book Transportation and Revolt, you will see very little that specifically identifies the kind of point of view with one sort of partisan coalition or another. Mm-hmm. I think I refer to James C. Scott, who's obviously a left anarchist, or he was since he passed away a couple months ago. I think I also frame a lot of that book in terms of a really great book from the 90s. I don't know if you've heard of it, Doug, called The Many-Headed Hydra. Is this something you've heard of by any chance?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's absolutely, it was a really influential, and that's a very explicitly like Marxist anarchist social history of basically social rebellions in like the North Atlantic, or like the port systems around the North Atlantic in like the 17th and 18th century, which they argue there was a kind of like proto-Marxist set of revolutionary energies from below occurring. Lots of intermixing between different oppressed groups. So there's something almost kind of like proto-intersectional about the way in which these two social historians, Peter Leinbach and Marcus Rediker, make this argument. But also like the setting of like these like port systems, ships, canals, sort of swamp mobilities. All that was really attractive to me in graduate school. And so that book, which is a very clearly left-wing in its sensibility.
Right.
And actually a lot, because it came out the same year as the Seattle protests and the anti-WTO protests, and was it 1999?
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that book, it's either in the intro or the conclusion, I don't remember which, but they explicitly like identify themselves with those protesters, those anti-globalization protesters. So it does sort of, that book is also it's from an earlier chapter of like what the left was, but like way back in the 1990s.
I am from that chapter. I'm 53 years old. I've been on the left.
I figured that out. And you didn't move on. I have to say, a lot of people in your cohort moved on, but you didn't. So good for you.
No, because it was too. I'm a fiction writer and novelist, and being a kind of radical, situationist oriented person was a part of my creative identity. Like the whole project of writing became about that. I early on I said, do I want to be a priest or a leftist? And I'll be a leftist. So I needed some bigger thing than my own creativity to align with as an artist, I thought. So it ended up being the left. Were you like at all part of like the punk scene in, I don't know, 80s, 90s? Was that sort of part of your scene, or not exactly? No, I wasn't a punk. I wasn't cool enough to be punk, but in the early 90s, I was part of the zine scene here in Portland. So I had a Diet Soap actually started in 1992 as a zine. And coming out of a Kinko's, and there's people I know who are like about 10 years older than me, maybe, like, so definitely much more like Gen X, whereas I'm kind of like
a little bit on the edge, more like an older millennial. I could be construed as an exennial, I guess. But anyway, like Gen Xers who were like very much like part of the punk movement around like, I don't know, early 90s, certain kind of like a hard edge anarchist left wing. But then maybe just it's part of the aging process. And, you know, they like bought a house and they had a family and they needed to come up with some way of like, kind of domesticating their own kind of political orientation. But I know a number of people who like they made a transition from that towards like kind of Obama era NGO advocacy very seamlessly. Like it was the exact same thing, even though from like a certain point of view, that whole like NGO world is like super establishment and super, I mean, this word is overused, but like super cringe. And like, if anything, the kind of punk thing to do would be to kind of revolt against that, and kind of be the opposite of it. And even if the opposite means, you know, the opposite could be construed as like reactionary, could totally be construed that way. And I noticed I kind of see with like a number of Gen X kind of punk leftists, there was a kind of self-gentrification, if you will, that I noticed, such that many of those same people would say, yeah, we need to crack down on misinformation online, and which doesn't seem like a very punk impulse to me.
When the Twitter files dropped, I became so angry with the people who in my milieu for their failure for most of them to take it up as a concern and as an outrage that they would have seen 20 years earlier, without problem. You know, like when the Patriot Act passed, I didn't know anyone who didn't oppose it. It was in part of the left. And when we realized, there's this war on disinformation that's actually censoring millions of Americans, the outrage just didn't arrive. The diet soap, again, this podcast you're on now started in 2009. It started just after Obama was elected. It was my attempt to understand the economic crisis of 2008. Originally, there used to be a Titanic factoid at the end of every episode because I thought our society was sinking like the Titanic, a little heavy-handed.
Oh, like a factoid about the ship.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Did you run out of factoids eventually?
Well, in 2012, it was the 100-year anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, and we put it to bed. But but overall, Diet Soap was this project of a left that would be critical of Obama, a left that did not see the moment as anywhere near enough of a change from the Bush era. That saw Obama as a continuity rather than as a disruption, and I ended up like talking to a variety of people who weren't on the left as I got started, because I talked to people who were like into backyard gardens as a kind of a survivalist kind of reaction to the economic crisis. I talked to people who loved psychedelic drugs. At the beginning of the podcast, it was a small scene, and I just reached out to people who I could find on iTunes, and it was a not so ideologically fixed of a podcast. I was the Marxist in a milieu that did not have any other Marxists. It was like more libertarians and things like that. So, yeah. But it was after, the WTO protests, which itself was not, certainly on the left, but was not at all similar to the NGO woke left of today. Because it included even paleoconservatives in its midst, people who were against globalism for other reasons and left-wing reasons. And so there was a mix of ideological types in what was
sort of like this sort of like puritanical horizontal coalitional policing for impure thoughts or something like that. That does seem like a somewhat that's like the kind of newer woke era left. It doesn't seem, I know some people will say that it was similar, like if the left of the 1960s was in some ways that way as well, though I'm not sure if that's right. It does not seem that the kind of more punk left of the 1990s was that way at all. And if anything, that when your generation was kind of coming into its own, it just doesn't seem like that impulse was there to be like, oh, but that other guy who's in our cohort, he's dating someone who's the wrong age, so we need to like turn on the ostracization machine. Like, it just seems like that impulse didn't exist in like in the 90s left. That maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it did, but it wasn't dominant. I mean, look, we had feminists in our midst back then, so that impulse did exist. But with the American Psycho was a book that no one was supposed to read, but we were all supposed to want to ban when it came out, in my milieu, but I said,
really?
Yeah, because there was a campaign against American Psycho, the novel. It was called like a manual on misogyny, and an instruction manual for would-be serial killers like men who wanted to kill women.
The author of that book is a gay man, and then the director of the movie that's produced so many memes is a woman, right? Like that,
right? But the movie hadn't come out.
It hadn't come out yet. I got that right.
It was like 91. I'm talking about, not.
Okay, I didn't know the book was that old. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So there were censorious and kind of, I would say, reactionary elements to the left in the 90s, but there was also a more dominant kind of anarchist, especially in Portland, left that was at the very least ambivalent about its own censoriousness, and was kind of wrestling with conflicting impulses, on the one hand to be PC, and on the other hand to be free and effective. I don't see the left of today as being entirely different from the left of the past. It's just acceptance so much as the way it's gotten worse is, from my perspective, and I'm not putting this forward as an academic thesis that I can defend, but it seems to me that the reason the left is so terrible now is not really because the left is so terrible, but because as a formation that just tails the Democrats, the Democrats' decline and embrace of more and more authoritarian forms of politics has meant that the left has become more and more authoritarian, less open to critical thinking, and more dysfunctional, because it is actually, and it has been all along, a faction within the Democratic Party. But need not have been, and I think should not be in the future. But
I mean, if anything, if you sort of think about when was a really perfect moment, I've been tweeting about this. If you think about a really perfect moment for a something like a left separatist, like separatist from the Democratic Party, like a new leftist party, maybe it wouldn't be leftist anymore, since the thing I said before is that you can't quite be the left anymore in this case, but something sort of separatist from the Democratic Party could have emerged. I think, many people would point to like Bernie Sanders in the 2012 campaign. I actually think the perfect window was actually, Bernie Sanders in the 2016 campaign. I think I misspoke a second before. Yeah. The perfect moment was 2012, really, because the financial crash was so fresh in everyone's minds. And also, like, frankly, people were like having trouble making rent and like affording groceries, and people were quite rationally frightened about like what the economic future held for them, especially younger people. And younger people tend to have a lot of the political energy that would be necessary for something like a new party to emerge. 2016 was maybe already a little too late. This sort of slow Obama recovery had sort of kicked in, and it was already the case, though Sanders was saying things that were very much oriented around the very recent memory of the 2008 financial crash and lingering anger at the finance sector about that, a sense that they had sort of made out like bandits. Whether or not they really did is maybe sort of up for debate, but there was certainly a widespread sense that somehow they had just gotten richer off the whole fiasco while everyone else had gotten poor. I think that was still kind of there in 2012, but maybe wasn't quite as like viscerally true anymore. But 2016. I keep mixing them up for some reason. It was still true in 2016, but I think 2012 maybe was the window. And yet 2012 was this time when there wasn't even a Sanders phenomenon yet. There was Occupy Wall Street, or really that had peaked the year before, but 2012 was still sort of felt like an Occupy kind of era thing. But Occupy went out of its way to avoid being like any kind of partisan political movement. It was sort of strange in hindsight and almost kind of suspicious because it seemed like that was maybe in hindsight that was kind of the moment that some kind of like maybe socialist or social democrat party could have actually really given Obama a run for his money in the 2012 election. Maybe.
Yeah, well, that just wasn't going to happen, and but for a variety of reasons, because there was not enough of a coherent political force to mount a real social democratic alternative, and if it had, it would have been a Green Party candidate or some other third party kind of candidate. But I do see what you're saying.
Why not Sanders? I mean, I don't even know the history of this. What was Sanders himself up to that year? Why did he wait all the way? Well, I mean,
Sanders was unhappy with Obama at that point. But if Sanders was going to run in 2012, he would have run against Obama in the primaries, right?
That's what he should have done.
Right, but if he had done that, he would have been ostracized from the Democratic Party dramatically, and he just himself didn't see it as the moment where he needed to step forward. And in fact, my understanding is that the reason Sanders ran in 2016 is because Elizabeth Warren didn't. Elizabeth Warren kind of became a major political figure in the Democratic Party in reaction to the 2008 crisis. She gained moral authority by taking on the big bankers and championing the homeowners who had lost their homes in the crisis and trying to push for a more egalitarian response that wouldn't just favor the big banks and all that kind of thing. She was in Michael Moore's movie, Capitalism, a Love Story.
Right, yeah.
Around that, yeah. So, but in 2011, with Occupy, at the time, I was doing the podcast, and a guy that I was podcasting with at that time, C. Derek Varn, told me, he said, "This is the death of anarchism. This is the last moment of anarchism on the American left." He was somewhat right, but the Occupy movement was definitely launched and an expression of 90s era anarchist politics. David Graeber was a big force behind the Occupy Wall Street movement. He wasn't the entirety of it, but he was seen as a leader of it. And the horizontalism came out of the kind of organizing from the 90s and before. And this idea of a protest movement without demands was kind of anarchist. And it was all kind of coming up at a moment where what people were excited by was that it was not a critique of this problem or that problem within capitalist society, but it was a critique of capital itself. It was aiming at the economic system overall. And after Occupy, and even before, Marxism became popular again in a bigger way. People started to read Marx and debate Marx.
but I mean, okay, so I'm sort of saying this. Maybe I sound like a kind of almost like the kind of hipster snob, but like I was reading tons of Marx before the financial crash, and then I suddenly, the crash happens and Occupy happens, and suddenly Marx becomes fashionable. But I couldn't help but notice that among a lot of people who suddenly got into Karl Marx in that era, they're the exact kinds of people who are very quick to pivot to this sort of like watered down NGO friendly version of Marxism, which came to be called intersectionality, or like maybe even wokeness itself winds up kind of being that. There came to be the very kinds of people who are like, the moment they saw that the leaders of BLM called themselves socialists, they were like, oh, aha, this is a socialist movement. It's just that simple then. That's all, that's it. Like the fact that like, maybe in a socialist society, you would also need to have police. That's irrelevant. Maybe the fact that police are unionized and that's actually something the labor movement ought to be grappling with or taking seriously, or even trying to pull them into the coalition in some way. That's irrelevant. The organizers are calling themselves socialists. And so that's all you need to know. And I just couldn't help but notice that it was a lot of the same people who just kind of got into Marxism on a whim during this OWS era, that were able to sort of pivot so easily a couple of years later in this particular way. I'm making the case, as I said before, that the issue is that the kind of the window on people actually feeling a tremendous amount of like material anxiety had kind of shut already by the year 2014 or 2015, because the slow recovery had actually kind of happened. As I understand it, the big banks did like pay off. Like they were bailed out, but they paid it off by that point. And so like any kind of like real visceral anger at Wall Street or at the finance sector itself was kind of beginning to melt away. And so it was easy for anger to then be like redirected at, the reason you're angry is because of the police. The reason you're angry is because of, people are saying reactionary things online. That's why you're angry. And by that point, it was just easier to sort of say, a true Marxist goes after the police. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like, how real was this Marxist turn that happened in like 2011? Really?
I'm not saying it
so fast.
I wouldn't say it's real. You can't really have a Marxist turn without an organized working class coalition, independent of, the universities or the Democrats. I mean, the fact that all along we're only talking about a faction within the Democratic Party, would mean that no, the Marxism that developed was not a Marxism that had legs. That it was it was a fad. I mean, but I picked it up myself as a lifelong anarchist who became disenchanted with my anarchism in the face of the 2008 crisis, like the anti-consumerism, the kind of hipster quality of some of that anarchism in the Pacific Northwest suddenly seemed impoverished in face of people being thrown out of their homes and the possibility of massive and the reality of massive unemployment and a realization that, actually, no, like never work is not a great motto to organize for socialism. Like, so I realized I didn't understand why the economic crisis had happened. There were lots of different stories about why it happened, and I didn't know exactly what to believe. The left at the time was talking out of both sides of its mouth. So like Howard Zinn was saying, this is basically it's a psyop, that there is no economic crisis. They could afford to put us all on the dole. And this just demonstrates is another way to attack the working class and redistribute the wealth from the bottom to the top. And I just thought, no, there is an economic crisis happening. We can't just act like this is not a change. So I started the podcast and started interviewing leftist economists and then eventually Marxist economists to try to figure out why the crisis had happened. So like as an intellectual project, I became a Marxist around that time, and I've stayed there and I haven't shifted. Although some aspects of what I do have shifted a lot, but I do agree, like as far as the left as a political force goes, I actually think 2011 was an important moment. The one thing that might have happened in 2011 would be that it would have been defeated, and those who had been defeated would recognize the defeat and the necessity to organize a longer term effort to reach out to working people and to create a socialist politics in America that was separate from the Democratic Party. Instead, what happened was Occupy Wall Street literally became Occupy Democrats. And
right, yeah, that was an actual, maybe they still exist. That's an actual Twitter account, right?
that's a Twitter account, but it's also an actual like nonprofit.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, right. And yeah, like the organization Move On.
Yeah, sure.
Move On. Yeah, like Occupy Democrats is kind of like Move On. Like it came out of a particular moment, particular crisis, and then just institutionalized and is now just another little grouplet in the Democratic Party's arsenal of grouplets or whatever. But yeah, so I would just say that the left, as I've understood it, has always been about taking young people who are dissatisfied with the society they're in a variety of ways, and offering them various critiques of that society, and tasking them with the job of transforming society. That's and it usually happens through.
But wouldn't that description characterize sort of like the young neo-reactionary kind of Pepe the Frog people? Like they tend to be young, they tend to be unhappy with what they see going on in society, and they feel called to change things. And yet, I guess ostensibly that seems to be something that's happening on the right wing. So I wonder if there's this definition of the left that more kind of comes from like James Burnham, the managerial revolution, which basically says that since the French Revolution, the left, which actually literally referred to like the left side of like some assembly hall at some stage in the French Revolution. My history of that era is spotty, but the left side of some assembly hall, that was the side that supported kind of like accelerating the upward political mobility of the ascendant class and the kind of ushering aside of the old established class. And so in the context of the French Revolution, that meant like the ascendant class was the bourgeoisie and the established class was, I guess, were the aristocrats. But then you could fast forward to a time when actually the established class becomes the bourgeoisie, the people who like own land and factories and big capital and things like this. And the ascendant class are the kind of professional managerialists. And this is what Burnham, writing in the late 20th century, is critiquing. And Burnham's own past as an intellectual, he was like a Trotskyist. And so you can sort of tell in the way he's sort of constructing his thesis that he's kind of thinking like a Marxist, but a Marxist who's shifted the identity of the two particular classes that are supposed to be in tension. So instead of it being the capitalists and the proletariat, it's like it becomes the bourgeoisie and the managerialists, essentially, with the actual working classes sort of off to the side or deciding who to side with in this big dispute. But anyway, the point is that the left within this framework, the left is defined as always being on the side of the ascendant class. And so if the ascendant class in a particular era are these sort of like, Obama affiliated technocrats, then that's the left, according to that definition. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, I've read some Burnham and I don't recall that definition of the left in Burnham, but I don't doubt you're right. That he defines it that way. When I think about Burnham, I think about how he left Marxism or Trotskyism and why, and how it kind of echoes or is a mirror of sensibility that you could also find within the Trotskyist Marxist left around the same time. So like both, like say someone like Adorno and Burnham looked to the present moment, like after World War II, as a moment where the old form of entrepreneurial competitive capitalism had been overcome by a managerial form of state capitalism. And for Burnham, he thought that meant that capitalism itself had been overcome and that we were no longer living in a society dominated by the capitalist class or capitalism, but rather we're living in a society dominated by the state and its managers. That's how I think about Burnham.
Yeah. I think that's I think that's like literally what he says. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. So, and then with Adorno and Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School guys, they thought that there was still a capitalist form of relations, that is, class society continued, but that it was being well managed to such a degree that organizing on the basis of labor no longer looked to be tenable, and because the contradictions in capitalism, particularly on the level of economic contradictions, had been overcome by the new managerial elite. But by the 1970s, that idea had been discredited because of the recession in the 1970s, and certainly by 2008, the fact that the global economic crisis, which no one saw coming, arriving, again discredited the idea that society isn't riven by the same contradictions that had been present in the 19th century. So I think Burnham's worth reading, but I think that his idea about how we had overcome capitalism and lived in a managerial state society, is discredited by history. Like, the recessions happened.
Isn't it possible rather than needing Burnham writing that book in the 1950s?
I think the managerial. I think it was the 40s. Yeah.
Okay. So rather than needing him to be like exactly right in all the particulars, can't we just sort of appropriate some useful ideas from that direction and say,
I definitely.
It seems like there is an ongoing struggle happening between a very powerful, let's call it like the capitalist class. Sure, that seems like a good word for it, and also a very powerful managerial kind of technocratic class, and that they're distinct in a lot. Of course, they're married to each other, and there's all sorts of ways in which you could probably make the case that they're like, from a sociological standpoint, they're kind of one and the same. But in terms of partisanship and different visions of society, and understanding a lot of the political struggles across multiple Western societies, if not all of them, that this is actually a very useful way to think about what's going on. And you do kind of need this kind of Burnhamite category of like the managerial class, or that's not the fashionable term online, or the fashionable term are these things like the cathedral, which comes from these libertarian neo-reactionary philosophers like Curtis Yarvin. But basically getting to the same idea. And of course, Yarvin, who I guess is very much on the side of kind of like the capitalists, would say that the cathedral is kind of all powerful and the big goal is to overthrow the cathedral. And so we don't necessarily have to go that far, but I think it's sort of useful to have his vision of like, the kind of Musk, Thiel, capitalist types, capital entrepreneurial types they're not really getting along, at least not these days, with the more kind of like NGO manager types. And I find this a useful way of thinking about where the big political tensions that we're seeing across our society are coming from. And as for the working class and like this vision of like what it would mean to have organized labor actually be able to kind of like imprint itself on our politics, I mean, clearly very marginalized right now and kind of in a position of having to decide like which one of these two big forces it's going to side with. One of the really kind of incredible things from this last election, I mean, there's a whole bunch of incredible things that happened, but the fact that organized labor, which really had been on the side of the Democrats, seems to be beginning to split. I think some people would even argue that the working class is on the side of the Republicans now. I think it's more like a split than a. Oh, were we talking about this? Okay.
I wrote a piece for Compact, and I think the stats are. It really depends on how you define the working class. But if you're just talking about working class people and not organized labor, which is like the union workers, but if you're just talking about working class people, I believe that Trump won the majority of their vote. If you use college education as a proxy, so if you're non-college educated, certainly there's no questioning that not only did Trump win the majority of the non-college educated white workers vote, but he, I think, won the majority of the non-college educated Latino workers vote, and made great strides with black workers and especially men. I mean, there's no questioning the fact that the Democratic Party is a party now of the educated elite, the college educated elite.
I'll be very interested to see, but by the time, over the next few years where we really see what like Trump 2 is really going to mean in terms of like the style of governance and, which institutions he's going to reward and which ones he's going to penalize and whether any of it's going to be executed competently and all those things. I will be interested to see if other big blue collar unions follow the Teamsters towards being explicitly aligned with like MAGA, which could easily happen. It's like easy to imagine things going in that direction, but It's also easy for me to imagine the kind of Trump has a lot of like very staunch, outspoken anti-union people who are near and dear to him in his current coalition, like Elon Musk. I think Thiel also is not particularly fond of organized labor, as far as I know. But in which case, probably a lot of unions, like sort of like small fry electricians unions and things, and organizations like that will kind of keep the whole thing, I think, more at arm's length, and will sort of try to remain good relations with the Democratic Party instead. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years. It would be fascinating if what you basically get is that like the blue collar unions all wind up with the Republicans, and then the kind of, I guess you could call them more like white collar, though it's a misnomer, but like white collar unions like the teachers unions or professor unions. I'm in a professor union. If they just all wind up with the Democrats, and that winds up becoming the way in which that kind of shakes out in terms of like labor polarization. Though who knows? That might not be what happens.
That seems likely to me, or at least it seems plausible. I want to go back to the idea of the cathedral and Burnham for just a second, and then I have some other questions I wrote down. But just to say that my critique of Burnham was not meant to say that he didn't have any good ideas. And I pointed out how he was echoing Adorno and Horkheimer precisely because I like Adorno and Horkheimer. They're Marxists, and they've got a critique that takes up the political reality after World War II, and Burnham did too. And I do think that the left needs to contend with the fact that the bureaucratic state, which goes back further than World War II, is big capital. It is not a tool that can be used by the left to accomplish socialism, or certainly not by Marxists to organize or in order to influence. So I do think Burnham is worth reading and understanding, and but I would just say that as a Marxist, I still think we need to address the deeper dynamic in society, which is the class character of society and the way that this society is in contradiction with itself, based on the contradictions actually in labor, in the way goods are produced to embody labor time and exchanged on that basis, and all that stuff I got out of reading Capital 15 years ago. It's like I still think that is necessary to hold on to and understand, and we shouldn't believe that that some class or another can come up and just manage this society without it heading towards crisis again. Like, the cycles of crisis will continue, and I think they intensify. They tend to intensify. So I am optimistic.
And yet it becomes so difficult. Like, I don't know, the graduate students at my university last year, they pushed really hard to get their own union, and much of the nature of the labor they do, just the way the 21st century academy is, at least in the United States, it's like it almost really could be like some sort of like a needle making factory that Marx would be critiquing in like Northern England in like the 19th century, because, you know, they just have like a big stack of exams or papers, and all the, you know, all the papers are arguing the exact same formulaic thing. So there's like a very repetitious quality to what the grad students are being asked to do. And so like, well, and so they're thinking, well, if we're going to be asked to do this very repetitious thing, we should at least be unionized so we can demand for better wages. We can get better wages, better benefits, all these sorts of things, which I was very supportive of them doing that. But I can't help but notice that there's this partisanization where it's like, it's not like any grad student unions are going to be following. I just can't imagine them following the Teamsters off in a kind of magoid direction. And so so like understanding the nature of that kind of sociological divide, which runs very deep. I don't actually think Burnham himself provides that much for understanding that, but that seems really important to me. Which I think Burnham seems like it's a very sociological phenomenon in terms of not just class sorting, but a certain kind of like both class and cultural sorting, which has been taking place.
I think Burnham might be helpful because, you know, those graduate students, yes, they're in a proletarian position as grad students doing the kind of work you described, but they're also aiming to join what Burnham would call the managerial class.
Right.
And so they're going to be aligned not as leftists, but as, you know, college-educated people possibly with PhDs eventually, with the party that represents their interests, which would be the Democratic Party. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, and also the other thing to remember when we think about labor, and this is what I wrote for Compact, when we think about labor politics, we think about it as the politics of NGOs, because the NLRB, or at least the politics of the bureaucratic state, because our labor is managed through the federal government, and so the labor movement has been statified. It is not independent, but rather is just, you know, the whole purpose of the NLRB is to harmonize and balance out the needs and desires of the capitalists and the workers, along with the state and the needs of the nation. So, whereas, you know, an independent working class movement and independent working class unions would have its own interests as its primary motivating force, and it would not be aiming at fitting into the continuation of the state capitalism or of the capitalist order. The aim of working class politics is to overcome, by taking political power for the working class, this form of society. So that's, you know, as a Marxist, that's what I'd like to see happen. And I don't think it will happen if the left or the socialists continue to tail the Democrats and be more concerned about their pronouns or about being invited to the right cocktail parties than they are about the truth and about, you know, their own independent political project. And it also won't happen if we're wanting results tomorrow, if we're always stuck in the immediate and can't think into the future. So
there's a number of specific issues. I mean, you probably noticed that online, I'm always going on about borders, borders and immigration as one of these. I see borders like the same way I see like bridges and tunnels, and like, borders at bridges and tunnels is actually a really good analogy, where like it's a core state function to take care of those things. It's not just supposed to be like nonprofit charities that are determining how many people are going to be settled in what town and like what lawyers to assign those people, and, you know, whether they should get cell phones right away when they arrive, or, you know, what hoops they have to jump through. Like those things, those decisions are essential state functions. And if the state you're living in is supposed to be a democratic state, then that means that it's something that the population gets to have a say in through the act of voting. And that's how I tend to look at it. But what I saw happen on the left over the last 10 or 15 years, it's this kind of like radical open border mindset, which I think a lot of people were telling themselves a kind of like a Marxist story of why that was the right position to have. Like, oh, in the Communist Manifesto, they talk about how all these like all that solid is supposed to melt into air, and like there's not supposed to be any more borders, which isn't really a correct interpretation of the manifesto, but like whatever, leave that aside for now. But the point is that it actually seemed to me more like it wasn't really about trying to adopt a kind of Marxist attitude towards borders, but more that it was more about sympathizing with the idea that NGOs actually ought to have the power over this particular kind of decision making. It was part of the story where the left became this NGO coalition. And if anything, it's the opposite party, which now seems to be adopting the idea that no, like the state ought to be responsible for this, for these like essential state functions, like governing the border. And that seems to be where things have shaken out. But that's an example where it's like, if you look at the specific issue, I think if the left had sort of maintained organized labor as like that's its main prism through which it's supposed to understand what to do, it would have said, oh, well, then clearly to have organized labor, you have to have a border. Like, unless your union is some sort of international union that can somehow coordinate between like dock workers in Shanghai and dock workers in Oakland, and like somehow maybe, but that's not really how organized labor is set up like in the real world. And so organized labor, it wants to protect its union members. And so that right there is a border. Right.
But I mean, in the 19th century,
the whole idea of organized labor.
In the 19th century, especially in Europe, organized labor did exactly what you're talking about, because organized labor was more mobile. It wasn't the organized labor was not captured by any given nation state. It wasn't integrated into the state the same way. So there was an ability to work, between the British and the Irish working class and coordinate together and things
That's
like
true.
that. So as a Marxist, the vision would be to build an international working class movement, but start in the United States by having a working class politics develop here that would be independent from the state and independent from the Democrats. And I think at first you just wouldn't have a stance on state policies when you don't have state power. What you would do is you'd say, okay, what are the needs of the working class given these conditions? What should socialists do to help the working class under these conditions? And how can we facilitate organizing and communication and cooperation between working people in the United States and maybe across the world now, rather than what do we want to say about which one of these parties do we want to side with in this moment? That's the wrong question. I do also think, though, that when it comes to the border, the way in which the Democrats became open border, the party of open borders, is worth examining, because I don't think, they weren't always, right? The Democrats were not always pro open borders, and I don't think it's the case that the far left pushed them and forced them to be the party of open borders. But I do think that in their defense against Trump, against the populist uprising, against the neoliberal order, which, by the way, happened in both parties. In the Republican Party, it was, that populist uprising took power. And then, and so the Democrats became the remaining party of the old neoliberal order. They were positioned so that they had to commit more and more to the rhetoric of open borders, even as they kind of continued on muddling along with both open and shut borders. But, deportations, Biden deported as many people as Trump did in his
Is that right?
his term. Yeah. And Obama deported even more people.
Is that in terms of like border encounters, that there's this huge spike in border encounters of like, I guess, illegal migrants that happened during Biden. And that's one of the big things that the Trump campaign was able to latch onto as part of their narrative of being like, it was necessary for Trump to come into power in order to resecure the border. Because there was this actual data of now, what is a border encounter? Is it the same person over and over again? Possibly. I was a little unclear about that. And it's interesting. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that the number of deportations was the same during the 4 years of Biden as during the 4 years of Trump once. That's rather interesing. And I know there was a lot of deportations under Obama too, I'm sure.
Yeah, more than either one of them under Obama. Yeah. So
and more not just because he had 8 years, but more per year. Is that your understanding of it?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, but yes, I believe that's true. More per year, yes. But yeah, because I think it was like you compare the last 4 years of Obama to the first 4 years of Trump to the first 4 years of Biden. I think is what I looked at. We should look that up maybe. But my overall point is that managing the flow of labor under a neoliberal order works in a certain way. But after the economic crisis of 2008, that global order needed to change and was started to change. But the political class was too ossified and inflexible and dysfunctional to really implement the changes to meet the moment. But through a populist uprising in democracy, we're now going to be seeing an attempt to rearrange the global order. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.